head of neurological surgery at Northwestern University in Chicago, and I had recognized that we needed nurses who were familiar with neurological surgery to care for our patients. We needed this because neurosurgeons could not be with their patients all the time, and they needed nurses to be there who would recognize what was happening to the patients to keep track of what was going on. There were no nurses any place in the United States at that time who were specially trained in neurological surgery. There were two programs in which some training was available. One was in Montreal, Canada, and the other one was in London. But these were of no help to us in the United States. Having decided that we needed an educational program for nurses in this field, I looked around to see what we could do about it. I was very fortunate. There was a young lady, whom you'll see in a moment, who was then Miss Agnes Marshall and later became Mrs. A. Earl Walker. Miss Marshall was in charge of neurosurgical education in the nursing school for undergraduate nurses and was doing a splendid job. So I recruited her to develop the program for graduate nurses in this field. What I'm about to tell you, and there were many developments, are all the result of the efforts of Miss Marshall. And she has been recognized by nurses throughout the world for her accomplishments. The first thing she did was to establish our program. And this she continued for several years and ultimately trained approximately 50 nurses in neurological surgery, several of these from other countries, as well as those from the United States. She not only planned the program of education for these girls, but she recruited people to teach in her program: neurological surgeons, neuropathologists, neuroradiologists, and neurologists. This worked out extremely well, and the girls were well trained as a result of her 8 months program. The nurses that she trained from Thailand and from Malaysia have since returned home and are continuing not only to work in neurological surgery there, but also have trained other nurses in this same field. In a short time, it became obvious to Miss Marshall that she needed a journal to educate nurses about what was going on in neurological surgery. And she created a journal of neurosurgical nurses. And then, through the instigation of Dr. Henry Schwartz of St. Louis, she and Barbara Thurian created the National Organization of Neurological Surgery. Later, it became obvious that an international organization was also needed, and Dr. Walker, who was then head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins and president of the World Federation of Neurological Surgery, induced Miss Marshall to undertake that development as well. Ultimately, Miss Marshall did this and is now known throughout the world for her accomplishments. She also has traveled to various countries and is familiar with the neurological surgeons in the Far East, in South America, and in Europe as well as in the United States. So that you can see that what I said to start with is true. She is responsible for the developments of nurses in neurological surgery. Walker, formerly Agnes Marshall, who is responsible for nurses in neurological surgery.
I would like to relate some of the historical developments of my program and of these several organizations and the people I have been involved with over a course of at least 10 years while I was in Chicago. I often refer to that period of time as the golden years in neurosurgery and neurosurgical nursing, and in a wonderful period in Chicago, because so many things were developing and there were many trends taking place in this nursing specialty and in neurosurgery per se. If we look back to the 50s, and of course post-World War II, many things were changing in medicine. We were having a scientific explosion of knowledge, and there was a lot of new equipment coming onto the market to help patients. And there were so many new ideas taking place in nursing as well as medicine. It was changing people. And in the late 50s and into the early 60s, we also had many changes with the attitudes of young people, even young people toward older people. We had this flower child of the 60s, and we had this development of the liberated woman. And all of this, because nursing is primarily a female role, all of this impacted nursing. And in general, over the years, nursing is a very traditional, a classic type of education and attitude toward science. However, as the 60s developed into the 70s and so on, there were vast changes taking place. And it was difficult in the 60s to be a nurse, to have been educated and have experience in nursing with a past with traditional values, and then you are confronted with a rather challenging environment. And a lot of the young people who entered the university and nursing were confrontational, but they were wanting change and they wanted to develop. So when I had been teaching before I had come to Wesley and to Dr. Bucy's department, I noticed that even with my educational background from the university, things were changing rapidly. And to make change within nursing, at least at Wesley, was quite a challenge because people don't like to change readily. However, with this challenge of change and with the motivation and the inspiration for this change, Dr. Bucy was very supportive and determined, as I was, to develop the program for neurosurgical nurses at Wesley and Northwestern University. So I started teaching, and it was interesting. I had undergraduate students, and before long we found the staff nurses, and especially the foreign nurses, coming to my classes. And the head nurse at that time was Dorothy Anderson, a very dear person, and she wanted her staff people to attend the classes because this was the only opportunity for them to learn additional nursing science and to learn about trends and so on. Well, we then, in time, found there was really a definite need for this to expand. And one day, Barbara Therian from St. Louis at Barnes Hospital had mentioned to Dr. Schwartz in some conversation, was there some organization that nurses could attend to learn more about neurosurgery? And he didn't know of any, and then they decided, well, maybe there should be a component to the neurosurgeons group, the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. So Dr. Schwartz then asked Dr. Bucy to see what he knew and what he could do about the situation. Well, he said he had someone who could, he thought, could be helpful. And we got the name of Barbara Therian, and we began to make some communication. We exchanged a few letters, and then we needed to get the interest of the other neurosurgeons. Did they have nurses who were interested? So in developing such a program or an organization. So we did this. Barbara said she knew of some people, some nurses around the country, and I said, well, I'll try to make some contacts. So I wrote letters to all the directors of neurosurgical programs for doctors and asked them to send their nurses' names who might be interested in such an organization to be a part of the neurosurgeons group. Well, we got numerous names from around the United States and Canada. And from that group of names, we then selected a cross-section of nurses to invite them to form an organizational committee and also to see what their ideas were so we could make some change within nursing. So we then developed a program, and Barbara and I met back and forth for about 6 months between St. Louis, this is, and Chicago. And we developed tentative bylaws and constitution and a philosophy for this organization. And then we invited as many nurses as we could who we thought would be interested. And we got 104 nurses to attend a Chicago meeting in 1968. And it was a very interesting meeting because there were nurses who came from the West Coast, of course, throughout the contiguous United States, as well as Canada. But all of them were very determined that they wanted to be heard and they wanted a part of this organization. So we knew that there was definite interest. And we wanted their input. Well, but they didn't want to necessarily assume an officer's position. So we said, well, we would get back with them, and we had 20 people who originally, I think it was, 14 people who originally formed the organizational committee. And Barbara Therian and I both presented a paper at this Chicago meeting to the general audience. And then we then selected our officers, and we passed on the bylaws, and we collected our first money. And with that initial money, this was to pay for postage and the general stationery and such. And that was a very good start. And I must say that the doctors were very pleased because they wanted us to have a collegial relationship with them and to say even participate in the presentation of projects and papers at these an annual meeting. And we were quite pleased with that. However, some doctors were not as pleased. They didn't want to be associated with the nurses. But I think in time, over the years, that has passed. The doctors were very generous as far as giving us the support of a program, executive director, and the one that we had the most contact with initially was Mike O'Connor. And he was very nice to us, and he gave us a lot of helpful hints. But after the second and third annual meetings, it was obvious that we had far too many nurses attending these meetings, and we really needed our own support system, our own executive director. And this always caused a little bit of friction because we didn't have a lot of money to support one 100%. So the doctors were generous to give us a part-time support system, and we were then able to develop further. We were a very nascent group, and we made a lot of mistakes, but that's a process of growing. And the doctors never really gave us a lump sum of money, as some people have thought. They were very generous. After our second meeting, which was in Cleveland, we had decided at that meeting, the nurses felt we needed some kind of publication so that others could read what was presented at these meetings, and a professional organization should have their own publication or journal. So it was decided that we would do so, and we had a small committee of 4 people. Jay Kent was the original editor, then Sylvia Kuttner was on the committee, and Maria Skritoulis was an additional member, and I said, because I was still president at the time, that it would be better if I handled the subscription fulfillment aspect and to get advertisers and such for the journal. Well, this worked out very well. However, our editor failed us a bit, and we then decided we could do better with one less on the committee. And our first publication came out, and this, I had it bound, but this is the very first one. It was supposed to come out in October, but the publisher didn't get us in scheduled correctly, so it actually came out in December. But it was the first copy of our, and the original papers presented at all of our meetings up to that point. And at that same meeting, we also decided that we needed, the girls, or the members I should say, really wanted a pin to designate their association with this society. So the same committee of Jay Kent and Sylvia Kuttner and I then designed, and we got a pin. Now I'll put that here. And then each officer from then on would, as they left office, would get a symbol of their office as a pin attachment. Now, at that Cleveland meeting, a nurse from Dr. Frank Mayfield's department raised her hand and said that Dr. Mayfield wanted to do something special for the nurses. So he offered to give us $300 a year to be used toward the nurses' organization expenses. And it was at that time that the group The membership wanted it to be designated, since it wasn't a great deal of money, but it was more than we had, to be used for the pin, because I had made an inquiry and the die cost alone was almost $300. So the membership was very pleased with this development. Well, it turned out that we didn't get the money right away for it, but when we made contact, the nurse made a mistake and it was only to be a one-time amount. But we were very pleased. Well, then we thought, where are we going to get the money for the journal? Well, the doctors, through Dr. Bucy, were informed that we needed a little startup money, or it would be helpful. Well, they too thought the conception and the development of a journal for our nascent organization was an excellent idea, so they gave us a one-time donation of $600, and then the auxiliary of the Congress of Neurological Surgeons was interested in doing something for nurses, and the Mrs. Mossberg was, I believe, president of that group, and she asked, what could the women do for the nurses? And I said, well, it would be wonderful if we had even $100 or whatever to contribute toward the cost of our first journal. Well, it took a long time, but then I received a letter and a check stating that there was $400 that they had collected and that we could use it for whatever purpose. So we added that to the cost of our journal, and we got our first publication out finally in 1969, and we were really thrilled. Now, of course, the journal is doing extremely well, and it has made many changes, and I can honestly admit, over a course of time, knowing how the changes have taken place in nursing, it too, the journal has really improved its content and entirely from cover to cover. And it is well regarded in nursing and in other professional organizations, and it was the first neurosurgical publication of its kind anywhere. In 1977, there was a plan to change the name of neurosurgical nursing to neuroscience nursing to encompass more of, to encompass nurses who work in neuropediatrics, neuro-oncology, neuroradiology, the operating rooms, and so on. So as a result, all publications and titles were then changed to neuroscience, which it is still today. Well, as my program in neurosurgical nursing was developing and all, and this American Association of Neuroscience Nurses now was strengthening and growing, we started out, as I said, with 104 nurses who attended our initial organizational meeting. However, today there is something like 3,000 members. So we have really grown since that period of time. Now, when you develop such a nursing program and you get recognized through your meetings and your, as we say, networking at these annual meetings and so on, you also get invited out to participate with other professional organizations and with and to go to various countries to help their nurses and so on. Well, this provided me with a wonderful opportunity to travel and to, as I say, spread the gospel. I had the first academic educational program for neurosurgical nurses. It wasn't just service. But the past history in nursing regarding postgraduate programs for nurses really were service-oriented, and you might even categorize them today as continuing education programs. However, some of them, and I might say most of them, were really not very therapeutic, shall we say. And the American Nurses Association and the National League for Nurses was very unhappy with them. And in the 50s and the 60s, they were trying to discourage their development. Also, in the early 60s, a position paper came out, was published by the American Nurses Association, and they were trying to close or stop the spread, shall we say, the encouragement of diploma nurse programs. And they wanted to get nursing back into an academic environment and upgrade and strengthen the academic educational credentials of the nurse. But at the same time, we also had practical nurse programs that were proliferating, and instead of being just a 4-month program or 6-month, they were going and strengthening their programs to 12 months, 18 months. Well, we were closing the 3-year program for the registered nurse, and we were encouraging the 2-year associate degree program in nursing and the 4-year program. Well, we also had a 5-year program in nursing. Well, if this sounds confusing, it was very confusing to many medical personnel as well as to the patients. They never knew what level nurse was coming in to care for them. And also, as the graduates of these various programs went out to work, they felt, how would you say, antagonistic toward those who were not with similar backgrounds. At the same time, we didn't have that many master's level prepared programs, nor doctorate or PhD level programs for nurses. There were a few, but there was nothing available for the nurse in neurosurgical or neuroscience nursing.
Aggie, I wonder if I might interrupt you. There is another aspect of this problem which you encountered. The hearers may conclude that everything always went very smoothly with Miss Marshall's program, but that's not the case. The Congress of the United States had allocated money to the National Institutes of Health to be used for the education of nurses in neurological surgery. And this money went to the National Institutes of Neurological Diseases and Blindness. They wished to support programs such as Miss Marshall's, which we and others applied for. The trouble was that the Council on Nursing of the Institutes of Health was composed of people who wanted these programs to be operated by people with master's and doctor's degrees. And there were no such people. It was impossible to create such programs because there were not nurses with that type of background. And therefore, the applications from our program and from other programs were turned down by this Council of Nurses because they weren't being handled by people with master's and doctor's degrees. The result was that the money allocated by Congress was never used.
To go. I really had a wonderful opportunity to travel to other countries, and this afforded me the opportunity to interview the nurses who did have similar neurosurgical programs in nursing in various hospitals, in South America, Asia, in England, and so forth. And it was through this association and experience that I was able to make changes in my own neurosurgical nursing program. I spent a couple months going to England and to Canada, and it was through Dr. Bucy's efforts to get me funding to do this. And I also got some additional funding through different drug companies and instrument companies to handle some of my travels. However, when I was in England, I had a wonderful association at the National Hospital, and I got to develop a close relationship with the matron M. Ling, and Sister Tutor Christine Rubin, who headed the department, or educational department there, and she had what was then called a postgraduate nurses program in neurological and neurosurgical nursing. And they had nurses from mostly from Europe and Asia, but a few from Canada and an occasional nurse or so from the United States in this program. And it was a 6-month program that could be extended to 1 year. Again, it was not fully an educational program, but it did provide many lovely experiences, classes, and so on. And it showed or gave the nurses an opportunity to see what nursing was like in another country. I really thought that Sister Tutor Christine Rubin was a very special person, and it was wonderful to have had an opportunity to exchange, or as we say, network with her. She had, I believe, started the program there in 1948, and in the 60s she then realized that we were developing nurse specialists. So she tried to make the changes, and it did attract more nurses from the United States. But we really didn't have much to offer the American nurses. However, I also went to Canada, to Toronto, and to Montreal. Now, Jessie Young in Toronto would hold periodic courses for a week or two, and it attracted many nurses, and it centered on neurological and neurosurgical nursing, and it was very popular. And then the Montreal Neurological had about a 6-month program, and it too attracted, I think, nurses primarily from Canada and, of course, from foreign countries, especially around the Orient. But I felt that there were aspects that weren't meeting the American nurses' interests, because we had made so many rapid changes, and the nurses were just very thirsty for knowledge. But Montreal gave wonderful clinical experience, and actually it's a very good place. And however, as my program developed in the United States, in Chicago, we then got numerous inquiries, but we had to keep a limit on the admission of students, because we only had room for a maximum of 6 or 7 in the program, and it was an 8-month program. We only held it once a year, and the students in the program were given a stipend to help them through, financially through their period in Chicago. However, they were never used for service, and they got to go to other hospitals to see how things were done throughout the Chicago area and surrounding suburbs and such. And I think from the comments the graduates made and my associations over the years with them, they really got a well-rounded program, and they could at least go out and function and do what was expected of them. And most of them now have master's degrees, and some of them are on their doctorate degrees. So I felt that that was a very good beginning for them.
I wonder, Aggie, if I could say something else
Oh, sure.
about your difficulties that we had to meet during your development of your program.
Sure.
Not only did we find barriers at the National Institutes of Health, but we also found them in our own institution. The nurses in charge of nursing at Wesley Hospital were not in favor of this program and not supportive. This finally became very apparent to the superintendent of the hospital, Mr. Hartman, who suggested, fortunately, that we transfer this program from the Department of Nursing at the hospital to the Department of Neurological Surgery. This we did, and Miss Marshall became a member of the faculty of Northwestern University and of the Division of Neurological Surgery. There was also intense support for this program from the Board of Trustees of the hospital, who awarded money so that these nurses could be housed and paid the stipend that Miss Marshall has spoken of. Not through the Department of Nursing, but through the hospital and through neurosurgery.
Were awarded at the end of the program, and we also, with this program, I had developed a program guide, and it was for neurosurgical nursing. And the thing is, my secretary, Peggy Agnes, found that there were so many inquiries for my program and for the educational tools I used. So it was as a result of these numerous inquiries from nurses and educators and doctors that I developed this seal and the book, and it sold very successfully. And it was copyrighted, and I might also add, a question frequently asked of me, was my program accredited? Yes, it was, with the Department of Education and Registration in Illinois and with the VA service, because the VA administration granted some of my students in the program monies. And in addition, this at that time had a very good bibliography list, and this is what was also requested. Nurses wanted a list of books. Now, Margaret Hulbert, if you recall, Dr. Bucy, was in Washington, D.C. with the NIH group, and she was very supportive of my work and encouraged me, and she too developed a bibliography list for nurses. Now, I show this as the brochure because many of the people asked about that. We just changed the name from Chicago Wesley Memorial Hospital to Northwestern, so you'll see the difference, because the hospital in 1970-71 had consolidated and made a name change. Now, I wanted to say that postgraduate programs, as earlier I had indicated, were not very popular with the American Nurses Association and with the National League of Nursing. And then, of course, we found we couldn't get adequate funding and so on for my type of program. However, it was the intent in the early 70s to get this accredited for university credit. And we were in that process when we found we didn't have funds. And that was not uncommon. Another point that could be made, many of the problems I had trying to establish this program were not uncommon in other hospitals, and it was for this reason they did not develop well in the United States. But to go back now to the American Association of Neurosurgical Nursing, we then felt as an organization that we could contribute more to the nurses' education in this nursing specialty. And it was a desire by me in particular from since I started the organization, that we should, if we're a professional organization, to have a certification. And so in about 1975, the organization felt it was needed, and the board of the American Association of Neurosurgical Nurses at that time went to the doctors, our affiliated group, neurosurgeons, and talked to them, and it was with their help that we made an application to NINCDS, and we got about $18,000, but I think the actual amount was a little less, but we got that startup money. And with a representative from the neurosurgeons group and a select group of our members, that was Vicki Stockton, Kathy Redelman, Marilyn Rickey, Pat Rauch, and myself, we developed the certification program. And before you can really get this underway, you have to have your standards developed for your specialty, and you have to have a core curriculum. So that was why we developed that first, and this was readily accepted through the American Nurses Association. Prior to this, in nursing, the AANN, American Nurses Association, felt they were losing hold of nursing and nurses. And I said we were a vocal group, the nurses were wanting a change. Well, there were many specialty organizations proliferating in medicine as well as in nursing. So the AANN said, well, we need to kind of get an umbrella hold and bring everybody together in nursing, because we are for nurses and nursing. So the Federation of Nursing Specialty Organizations was developed, and then they suggested things that we followed through with, and that was the standards of care and the core curriculum, and then we went to certification. And we worked very cooperatively with the AANN, and when we developed this certification process, we brought in a representative from the neurosurgeons group, your group. We brought them in from the government to see what we were doing with their monies. We brought in a representative from the critical care nurses organization, the operating room nurses, and so on. And we eventually developed a test and a large test pool of questions. And we then hired the psychological corporation. Dr. Sally Ann Henry was our director then, and she helped us develop this test, and it is a very fine program for neurosurgical nurses to undertake. And we give the test several times a year throughout the United States, and we have Canadians who take it, and others. Anyone can take it as long as they're a registered nurse. And it is an examination that's given, and it is, if you pass, you are certified for about 5 years. Now, a lot of people say, of what value is certification? It should be lifelong credential. However, we felt that continuing education is an ongoing process, and that the same would be applicable to the certification. So we have them recertify after about 5 years. Now, I feel that the test is upgraded all the time, the members change on the committee, and so on. And I think it's a very fine program, and we are well received and accepted by the states. They recognize our credentials, the state licensing bodies, and our American Nurses Association, and so on. And it's been a feather in our cap to have developed within the short span of time that we have been organized to have achieved this. And we are also, because we have expanded so in membership, and especially with the change in name, we are now financially more independent, and we are having a higher level of program presentation. We give a lot of in small programs around the United States. We have regionalization, so that nurses who want to upgrade or to get more involved in neurosurgical nursing, there are many programs out there that are inexpensive that they can take advantage of. And from all of this, the American Association has been a real leader. However, other countries recognized that we had such potential and that they too had something to offer. And before long, the Canada recognized they could do something. So in 1969, I was asked, as you had heard, that Dr. Walker thought it was necessary, it was timely, that a World Federation of Neurosurgical Nurses should be developed. And I recognized that there were, through my associations in other countries, there were other nurse groups specialized in neurosurgical nursing. And so I went to to a number of foreign countries and tried to find out more about them. There is a Latin American nurses group, a component of the Latin American Neurological Surgeons group, and it is primarily for nurses from Mexico, Central America, and Latin America. And they meet not regularly, but about every 2 years or so when the doctors meet, and they hold a course usually, or some aspect of their program is devoted to the education of nurses in neurosurgical and neurological nursing. And I found that they had had programs a long time, and they too had also done research work in this field, and we knew nothing about it. So it was in that area, as well as England, and of course Canada. So I tried very hard to get them to organize and to come to an organizational meeting in New York. This was in 1969, and we were then able to form the World Federation of Neurosurgical Nurses. It was a very important meeting. We had representatives from 6 countries there, and we decided, since we were invited to be an affiliate of the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies, that we would see what we could do with the foreign nurses. So all the nurses who were from the various countries went back, and we tried to have them develop organizations in their country, and then these would be affiliated or a member of our World Federation of Neurosurgical Nurses. Well, to date, we've had a few changes. We have about 14 countries who are members. The one, I think, rather major change is that instead of, we have a number of European societies for neurosurgical nursing. However, they too felt the name change was essential. So in about 1980, 81, many of them changed to the World Federation, or their Federation of Neuroscience Nursing. And I think in a way this was good, because it brought in more members. And they then could develop and stress what was necessary in their own countries, and then bring their ideas and their research and present it at our quadrennial meetings. It was interesting. If I thought I had problems in nursing, they too had multiple problems. We decided long ago that English would be the language to be used. Well, we had to communicate, and most foreign people do know some English, but they agreed that they would provide their own translations or translators if necessary. Well, they too had problems with religion and with cultural differences that we take for granted. We're not. It's not a problem to Americans, not like it is to some of these foreign nurses. But when you got the Christians and the Democrats together in some of these countries, they wouldn't talk to one another. Then they were going to split, etc., in their membership. Well, now things are finally settling down. And when we would meet in foreign countries, the next meeting, a very important meeting, was in Japan. Well, the Japanese are so well organized that we didn't really have to face too many organizational problems. But when we went to Brazil, oh, did we have problems. And it wasn't that it was the Brazilians per se, it's their system. Just to get a slide projector, or you can bring money in, but you can't take it out. And when you charge a registration fee, it's very difficult. And to just get certain equipment necessary to hold a meeting. And we had serious breakdowns in communications. Well, you always learn, and these are all growing pains in a new organization. But now things have worked out quite well, and we have things now written down in such a way that anyone taking over, regardless of the language, as long as they can get someone to translate, we can manage. The World Federation now is a very cohesive group. It's interesting because we have such a vast, a wide range of backgrounds and experiences to call upon. We had a meeting in Anaheim last September. We didn't have a very large group, but we had a very motivated, stimulated group of nurses. And the Japanese were there, and they were most generous in their contribution to the Federation. It was also an important historic meeting for us because we gave the first research award out to Karen Marsh. She got $1,000 for her project, and she will present the study in full when we meet again in Acapulco in, say, 3.5 years from now. This was very important. It's hard to get nurses interested in research. The foreign nurses would like to do it, but some of them don't know how to go about it. We do now have some guidelines, and we're trying to encourage them. Not that all research at this time has to be at a doctoral level. We would like to encourage at least to get the beginnings started in some of these countries. And this, I think, will eventually take off and more nurses will engage in research and will help a lot of nurses then. One thing I would like to relate, it's hard to see, the American Association has done a volume of work in a short period of time in their growth, like getting the journal out and then the core curriculum and so on. We are now even in sending 2 of our members, I think it's once a year, to Washington, D.C. to find out how legislation develops and so on and so forth. Well, with the foreign countries, I have found that we were, as an American society, instrumental in motivating them when they went back to do something for their country. Now, as of today, most countries have a publication out now. Not all of them are as well developed as our journal, but they do have something out. They publish the papers presented at their meetings. We have one major meeting a year in the American Association, as I said previously. But some of these foreign countries, like Belgium and Holland and Spain and so on, they meet more than once a year. And they have, initially, most of the groups were affiliated with a doctor's group. But they were able to go to their nursing, major nursing organization and be accepted and recognized by them. And I think that's very good if you can do that initially. And they are then supported by them. They follow their national rules and regulations, you know. And the other thing is, I think the Italians were very reticent in developing such a society, but they decided they had such educational demands and such need to make change that their society developed their curriculum for neurosurgical nursing for Italy. And they have publications out and so on. Well, Spain has developed now, Germany, Great Britain, and now Europe has their own. They also have an association of European Association of Neuroscience Nurses. So some of a bit of our membership by society has decreased, but it has actually increased because of the European expansion. And now with the changes in Europe, East Europe, I believe that we will finally be able to get nurses from the Eastern Bloc countries. And when I had been there before, they wanted an association. They wanted to be tied into the World Federation, but they had no money and no government support. And they could not get out of the country. So now I think the future is very bright for neurosurgical and neurological neuroscience nursing and nurses. And because of the changes over the last 10 to 15 years in education, I do believe the entry level should be entry level into at least neurosurgical nursing should be at the baccalaureate degree or the minimum of the associate degree level. And I think nurses who are really going to do something and stay in neurosurgical or the neurosciences should be specialized, and that area should be handled by a master's level prepared. A nurse should be master's prepared in her specialty. The thing is, we need to get more monies available for nurses to have such an education and be encouraged through a career ladder move upward. I don't know that you have to have a doctorate degree unless you're going to teach or administer. But I do think in the clinical area and in some educational programs, it has to be at least a master's level. As we move up the career ladder in nursing, to recognize that nurses with more education also develop professionalism, and with that they then gain more respect by their colleagues and other associated professions. Now, years ago, nurses did not have the highest respectability. Many of them were often thought of as prostitutes, handmaidens to the doctor. And for some reason, some of this attitude continues today, but it's a false attitude. The nurses worked very, very hard. Now, in some of the other foreign countries, Latin America, I'll just be non-specific here, and parts of Europe and so on, maybe not too many years ago that was true. But with more education and in an expanded role, the nurse can be a very great contributor to her profession and to her colleagues. I think it's important to recognize that language is, we speak English primarily in the United States, but in foreign countries, even one country alone, like Switzerland, may have 5 official languages. So, and then there are other countries in Latin America, for instance, or in Asia. So we need one common language, and today it seems to be English. And I think our members are very eager to learn English so that they can then communicate with other nurses in order to improve their own status and educational abilities. Now, one area that has not been mentioned actually is the financial aspect. Nurses today in the United States have a much better salary range and opportunities financially, benefits of employment, shall we say, today than they ever did before. Now, some areas of the country don't recognize the nurse like she should be accepted and recognized, but that'll always be. However, in some foreign countries, the nurse makes such a pittance, such a low salary, and her, as I said, her status is not very high. It's hard for them to raise a family or to even go back to school and so on. Another aspect that must be changed is that the nurse has always been, in the past, used for service, so she got her housing, room and board in other words, even laundry handled, and any medical problems handled by the institution or facility where she worked. Well, today, the healthcare, at least in the Western countries, cannot continue this readily. And so the nurse, and there is always, it seems, a shortage of nurses, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And because of their low salary range, they are not able to really improve upon themselves. So they really need encouragement. They need something like the World Federation to be able to lean on, to go to learn. And I think that the doctors who usually make a great deal more money than nurses, I say usually because I know some doctors at university institutions in some of the foreign countries really don't make a great deal of money. So the government supports them to various professional meetings, but they don't readily support nurses to meetings. So I think if doctors who have more political clout or administrators, if they could get together and try to support some of their nurses, at least to the World Federation or to their own European society or Asian, I think it would be very beneficial. And they, in turn, the country will then benefit immeasurably. I think that it's interesting that Australia has developed a lot, and their nurses are encouraged by their doctors for participation in meetings. And the Australasian group now has the nurses from Tasmania and New Zealand in their organization. Now, we still have to work on countries like India. They need a great deal of help. And in China. But it's interesting in Japan, Dr. Sano and Dr. Ishii, but especially Dr. Ishii, as I understand, went to his government and made a plea for them to give the nurses money in this specialty in order for them to develop and improve conditions. And they got the equivalent of $9,000 a year for about 9 to 10 years. And when the Japanese nurses came, they were to the Anaheim meeting last September. They naturally come in a larger group. There were 40 of them who attended, and they had their own interpreters, and they had several business people with them, and everything was recorded at that meeting. They also told us, the nurses told us, they needed our input as they were going to do some work on brain death, and they wanted to know how they could change their cultural patterns and attitudes, and they were going to, with this information that we could help them with, they were then going to try to get legislation passed in Japan to set standards for brain death so that the nurses could follow, because they have nothing, and they have to put up with many problems with families and religion and so on. And I think it's a wonderful stimulus to hear how they are thinking, how they are trying to make change to benefit the patient and his care. And as the nurse is allowed to get more education, more respect, an improved salary, and a career ladder move, I think the future in the neurosciences in nursing is extremely bright. Thank you.
I wonder if there's one other small thing that I could say. In this area of brain death, Agnes's husband is the world authority and has published a book on the subject and is consulted all over the world about this problem. So this is something that Agnes is very familiar with. Thank you.
doctors who were not vocal, at least directly to nurses, but who were very supportive of our affiliation and what we were attempting to do for nurses in the specialty. And there was Dr. Desessar, Dr. McCarthy, Dr. Drake in Canada, and also I have to admit that Dr. Paul Bucy has given undying support to us. He helped direct us in our organization, in our affairs when we asked him. He was really very generous with us in giving of his time and his knowledge to us. And I too would like to thank Dr. Asano in Japan and Dr. Ishii, because they were very, very supportive in the Tokyo meeting in getting the nurses together, and it was just an unheard of thing almost to get the doctors to help the nurses over there in such a large venture. But that meeting was so well organized and managed that I think they, for their efforts to the Japanese nurses and the nursing organization, Japanese Nurses Organization, really deserve credit, along with their associations with the different companies who helped provide support for that meeting. And Dr. Pimenta in Brazil tried very hard to give us support, and it was very troubling times because some of these countries have internal problems we're not aware of, but he sure was very supportive. And lastly, I think that my husband, Dr. Walker, should be mentioned because he's done more to help than I ever recognized or knew prior to my marrying him. I learned later how much he was supportive, and it was through him and his efforts that we got money from the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies. We got 2 large grants. One was $1,000 and another was $3,000. And I thought that was most kind, most generous, because this enabled us to continue our efforts in the World Federation in the early days. I'd also like to mention that Vicki Stockton, Mrs. Appel now, I thought worked extremely hard to see that we got the certification committee and the core curriculum and the committee members to unite and to get this program off the ground. Without their real earnest desires to develop this course, we would not be where we are. And there were other silent members, but I think in the early days we worked very hard, and Vicki Stockton Appel needs a lot of credit for that. And there have been others, and we don't have time to mention them all, but the nurses, I think, are a very cohesive group. They do voice their concerns, they're not afraid to speak up, and they are now, as a result, doing wonderful things for neurosurgical nursing and for their patients. And therefore, I think with continued involvement and our affiliation with the neurosurgeons group and with others, that we will have a very bright future, and the demands will continue, but we will meet these demands and challenges. Supportive and motivating to nurses in Latin America was in Santiago, Chile, Dr. Alfonso Asenjo. And he gave a great deal of support educationally to his nurses, And he had his operating room nurse in particular be instrumental in forming the Latin American Neurosurgical and Neurological Nurses Organization. And she then, with her motivation, helped nurses in Argentina, Brazil, Panama, Mexico, and so on. So I think that he and his efforts need to be recognized. Thank you very much.